Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Slavery Archive Book Club. This is our first session of 2021. We are meeting on Zoom as usual, and you are also broadcasting this on YouTube. My name is Ana Lúcia Araújo. I am professor of history at Harvard University, and I am hosting this book club along with my co-hosts that I want to introduce you. Then they are Jessica Marie Johnson from Johns Hopkins University, also Vanessa Holden from University of Kentucky, and my colleague Alex. He'll let me see where he is. I am not seeing him to spotlight, but you can spotlight yourself, Alex. Okay, let's see. Here he is, Alex from Columbia University. Then this is an initiative that we started last year when COVID-19 hit us, and you are continuing now. We are meeting today to discuss this book, and the editors and the co-authors are with us here. Then the book is African Women in the Atlantic World, Property, Vulnerability, and Mobility, 1660-1880. And this is added by then Mariana Candido, that you are going to see her soon. Then she's just here on your screen, and also Adam Jones, which I am trying to spotlight here. And several of the contributors to this volume, they are also here with us. But let me introduce then Mariana Candido. I will not give you a full bio of Mariana and Adam, but I just want to emphasize that Mariana Candido is an associate professor in the Department of History at Emory University. And Adam Jones, he is an emeritus professor at University of Leipzig in Germany. And we have several of the contributors to this volume who are here with us. Then I will not tell you who are here and who is not, but among the contributors that we have, then Suzanne Schwartz, we have Hassan Sarr, Esteban Salas, that along with Suzanne, I know they are here. Of course, Mariana Candido is one of the authors, Adam Jones as well. Nathalie Everts, I don't know if she's around. Ademide Adeluzi Adelouis, also who is here. Christine Mann, also here. Colin Krieger. Laurel Samley, I don't know if she's around. Vanessa Oliveira, and also Hilary Jones, who are both here with us. Then we are going to have a short introduction from Mariana and Adam, who will just perhaps contextualize what this book is about, from where did it come from, and so on. And then we can move to the questions. And of course, questions can be addressed to the editors and to any of the contributors to the book. This is a book that was published in 2019. It was just released also in paperback. Then if you didn't get the book yet, you have an opportunity of having this overview. And I would say that the book is particularly interesting and original to be I would say, adopted in the classroom for any of you who are teaching topics related to this issue of women in the African diaspora. We are going to take your questions here on Zoom. Then turn on your video when you want to ask your questions, if you have your video. You are going to take questions also from YouTube. If you are watching on Twitter, you can always ask your questions from there. And for those of you, just when you are going to start the presentation, just if you can turn off the mic when you are not speaking, because if there is any background noise, you are going to get rid of that if you turn it off. Now I will just remove the spotlights here to just leave Mariana and Adam. And welcome everyone. I know that this is a weird day for us who are in the United States, to not say that is a traumatic day, but the choice that you made here is to choose a scholarship and to choose our scholarly community, because we have to remain strong and not afraid of coward mobsters who are trying, as in many other occasions, taking control of and to turn on off then to turn down the democratic processes. But we know that this is going to pass, and this is why you are here. Then let's start, and I just leave Mariana and Adam.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the hosts for inviting Adam Jones and I to have a chance to talk about our book. I also would like to thank the contributors who, despite everything that is going on in the US, many of them also logging outside of the US, have decided to join us today. So I'm very grateful for this space to talk about our work and this book with you today. And also to stress that today is a very exciting day. I am a recently relocated person to Georgia. This is the first time that I voted in Georgia. So today is a very special day for me as a newly naturalized American citizen and Georgia voter. So it's also a special day for different reasons. Um, but going back to the book, so the idea about this book started to take place perhaps 6 years ago, 7 years ago, in an African Studies Association meeting, where I put together a series of panels about women. And I invited people whose work I admire, people who are nice scholars, but also nice human beings who I wanted to see in the conference and who I wanted to see them. And the conversations that emerged 6 years ago led to a series of other panels, and it resulted with a very important panel that happened in ASA UK 5 years ago, Adams, perhaps, where we had two set of panels also about women. And in that moment, it became clear that there was not only interesting new scholarship about African women before the 20th century, because all of us were working on periods before the 20th century, but also that there was an interest from James Currey to put together a volume and bring in these studies. An essential partner in this entire process was Zilk, that I will now destroy her last name, as I always do when I speak her last name. Zilk is Stricteroid, and she always correct me when I speak her last name, and Adam will correct me, hopefully. But unfortunately, Zilk could not stay in the project. But this led to a very interesting exchange of ideas with Adam Jones, who was part of the ASA UK panel, and who pushed both of us to think about putting a volume together, because he saw the potential that the research of several colleagues had, and the idea that we should in many ways go back to these books published in the late 1970s by Edna Bay and Nancy Hopkins on women in Africa, but also to honor the important scholarship of Claire Robertson and Martin Klein, who had published Women in Slavery in Africa in the early 1980s, and which is such an important book. And somehow there wasn't another collection covering the entire continent and looking at women's experiences in different moments. There was important monographs, important articles, important studies, and many of the contributors to the volumes are these people. Here I'm thinking about Christine Mann's work, Hilary Jones' work, Laurel Simley, Vanessa Oliveira, and so many others who have been writing and doing research and writing about African women. But Adam rightly indicated the lack of a single volume where we could have a comparative perspective, bringing different time periods, different regions of the continent. And this is how this book came together. So the people who became part, the contributors of the book, the authors, are people who are involved in these panels, um, two panels in the ASA, the American version and the ASA UK. And it was a good combination in the sense that we have a good coverage of the African continent. It's not a volume solely focusing on West Africa, that tends to happen, or a volume that only focuses on West Central Africa, or a volume that only focuses on the 19th century. But it was a good combination of people covering different parts of the continent, different time periods, but also a good combination in terms of junior scholars, which was also important to us as organizers, to have a balance in terms of having junior scholars, people who recently finished their PhD or working on the PhD, as the case of Esteban Salas, but also senior scholars in a conversation about the different roles that African women had in different societies in different time periods. So after that, I was teaching at the University of Notre Dame, and the University of Notre Dame was very generous to organize a workshop or to fund a workshop in Dublin, where we all flew to Dublin. Remember the days that we could take a plane and fly? It was the beginning of the Trump whatever. So we had to deal also with the Muslim ban, which was a major concern for some of the contributors in the volume, and we had to deal with this logistic, but we managed to go to Dublin, and it was a very productive 2 days workshop where we had a chance to read each other paper, talk about the work, and what you see is basically the result of the Dublin workshop. Where we had wonderful days in Dublin talking about research methodology, very careful criticism to see the gaps in our arguments, the problems with our own work. I got excellent feedback on my own work during that workshop. So that was important in putting the volume together. And although we didn't have a theme by the time of the workshop, we let scholars present what they were working on. It became evident that there were three main topics, which is property. There were a lot, as you can see in the chapter, there are several chapters that deal with women accumulating land and enjoying land access, which is a big topic, a big theme in Africanist scholarship. But it also becomes evident that some of these women who are powerful should not occupy the whole space in the book. And we should talk about the women who are impoverished and who didn't enjoy the same degree of protection and privilege, the women who are vulnerable and remain in different degrees of oppression in the African continent. And mobility, which is also a big theme in the book of many of these women who not only enjoy economic mobility, social mobility, but also physical mobility. Many of the contributors focus on women who move in different spaces, but also women who moved across the ocean, so outside of the African continent. I want to make sure that Adam can talk a little bit. So I will not go too much into the books, but I think one idea that hopefully you get from this volume is something that Laurel Simley stresses in her chapter, is the idea that African urban spaces were dominated by women. And this is very clear in every single one of the chapters. African cities, African ports, African coastal towns are places where there is a large number, in some cases, the majority of the population were women, but women are also not only in economic, occupying economic roles, but also different other roles as we discuss in different chapters. So I will stop here because I am already my 10 minutes mark and let Adam complement my comments.
Okay, thank you, Mariana. I'm on now, am I? Can people hear me? Yes. Our job is to get those of you who haven't already bought the book to buy it. So I should just reinforce what Mariana has been saying by saying what is new about this book. She mentioned Robertson and Klein. Of course, that is big feat for us to try and tread on. We have a slightly different focus, which comes in the title, of course. We have the Atlantic focus, including not just West, but also West Central Africa. We have a very good chronological spread, I think, extending from the late 17th century, two contributions to the late 17th century, 4 contributions deal with the 18th century, and the remaining 6 are on the mid-19th century, nothing on the official colonial period, which of course, as Mariana has emphasized, is not the whole thing. So that is one thing. I think the book tells us a lot about heterogeneity of our topic. We are dealing with some very rich women in history, whether they lived in Saint Louis or in Lagos or in Benguela. On the other hand, we're dealing with uprooted recaptives who end up trying to become head of a female-headed household in Freetown, and with a lot of very poor women as well. And we're dealing with the enslaved within Africa, whether these people are household slaves or agricultural slaves or performing sexual labor. So we put, by covering this wide range of topics, I think we are giving a new perspective on this aspect of African and Atlantic history. A third novelty, I think, is it's not entirely different from what Robertson and Klein did, but we do have an enormous number of life stories showing how almost every African woman in history has a multiple identity. We have, for example, Colin Krieger's wonderful piece of detective work putting together 2 women with totally different names and suggesting that it is really just one woman in different periods of history. In the Gambia, we have Asan Sarr dealing with 3 Gambian women in the 19th century. Laurel Semley, who has written a whole book about it, is giving us a chapter about the French Atlantic, one woman crossing the Atlantic. Natalie Everts gives us 4 Gold Coast biographies of women living on the coast. Ademide Adelusi Adeluyi gives stories of 2 women who were pushed around Lagos and the lagoons in the mid-19th century. Christine Mann gives us a long, an exciting detective story, we can say, ending up in a court case, a murder case of a woman who moves from Brazil back to Lagos, or to Lagos. And okay, we have a lot of these very exciting life stories, I think. Finally, I would say that our book makes a contribution to source criticism. We have both Colleen and Christine emphasizing how there are gaps in the biographies, and that even very detailed court records leave many aspects of a story unexplained, where we just have to pose questions and pose hypotheses. My own chapter deals with the ambiguity of the sources on sexual labor, whether we can call it prostitution or whether we should call it rape. And generally our authors are using an enormous range of sources. We have interviews, censuses, court minutes, maps, inventories, you name it, it's in the book somewhere. So that's a couple of reasons why our book must be on everybody's shelf.
Thank you so much, Mariana and Adam. And of course, if you have now questions, we can just raise your hand. I don't know if you know how to do it. You have to go at the bottom of the screen and click on your name. And there is a way for you to raise your hand. You can always tell us that you want to talk on the chat as well. And like this, we can just unmute you, and you can unmute yourself, and the video will be spotlighted.
Can I also stress another point that I did not have a chance to talk earlier? I think one thing that is important in this volume, and hopefully it's important not only for people working on Africa, but people outside of people who are interested in the African diaspora, is that it brings together West Africa and West Central Africa, usually parts of the continent that are treated separately in scholarships that not necessarily dialogue. And I think we made an effort here um, um, to bridge these arbitrary divisions that historians create about the African continent, but also what is related to our own linguistic abilities in many ways, that we tend to focus on regions that we know the language and we neglect other parts. And what we see happening here is that these are people working in different parts of the continent that are later on were colonized by, at that moment, were colonized by different European powers. So it's not about only formerly British territories or French colonies or Portuguese regions. So there is an effort also to bring West Central Africa and West Africa together. And it's important to recognize that more Africans crossed the Atlantic before the 20th century, forcibly crossed the Atlantic before the 20th century than Europeans. And the number of African women is particularly important. And for many scholars working in the African diaspora, the lack of scholarship about what happened in the African continent becomes a problem, because we project this imaginary Africa, homogeneous Africa. And what we are trying to show here is how this, although there are these big themes, the situation was also very different for the women who remain in Africa, free or enslaved, and they had to cope with these major changes happening during the era of the transatlantic slave trade.
Thank you. I am not seeing any hands here, but let me see if anybody wants to ask any questions. Otherwise, you can always start with some perhaps of the authors, if you have, if you want to add anything, the authors who are among us.
I have a quick question. Can you hear me?
Yes, this is Tatiana.
Okay,
Let me
great.
see if I can spotlight you.
Well, that's okay.
Go ahead.
First, thank you so much for writing this book. I come across a lot of African women in the archives in Mexico, and to now know a little bit more about their homeland and their economic activity in their homeland is really so useful for my own work. So thank you for that. I did, however, want to maybe hear from some of the collaborators, some of the people who wrote the chapters. I think I'd be interested to hear how being part of this kind of more hemispheric collection shaped what you brought to the table. I try to do hemispheric myself in some of my political work, and I'm always interested to find out what other people are thinking of what it means to do kind of hemispheric Africa, hemispheric Americas.
Thank you, Tatiana. Let's see if who wants to jump in to answer that. Among the authors, if not, then the editors. But let's see if
Professor Mann smiling, so maybe she.
Okay, she wants.
Well, I guess I would say, because I've been involved in a hemispheric project. I'm working on a hemispheric project and writing what I dealt with in this particular chapter, it's part of a larger project that I'm developing into a book. And my subjects were enslaved in a particular place in Africa. And I began the research inside Africa, working with especially early colonial court records. When people came to the court, they often told retrospective stories that revealed information about earlier periods in their lives, in my case, decades before. And I learned from the records that two of the three had been taken to Brazil. And in Brazil, ultimately, they manumitted themselves, and later on, they came back to Africa. The third was a slave in Africa. She too was freed and reunited with the two who came back from Africa. And so the title of the book is Transatlantic Lives, Slavery and Freedom in West Africa and Brazil. And I really am trying to reconstruct a transatlantic story. And I didn't know where the work would take me when I began it. It took me a while to decide, okay, I'm really going to have to go and do research in Brazil. And I had to start to learn Portuguese and go to Bahia and familiarize myself with new archives. And then I discovered that one, Ajatu, who I talk about in this paper, was in fact, she ended up in Rio, whether through the inter-Brazilian slave trade or having freed herself, whether she migrated to Rio voluntarily. And so I really haven't done all that I should do in Rio archives. But all of a sudden I realized, oh my gosh, it wasn't enough just to try to figure out the archives in Bahia. I should really go to Rio and try to figure out the archives in Rio. And that's just was for me a daunting idea. And then they all returned and reunited in Lagos and Abeokuta. And what I seek to do in the book is really follow them from the time they were young children. They were probably enslaved in 1822. The last of them died in 1894. He lived a very long time. And so their lives span much of the 19th century. And I guess ultimately what I'm trying to do is view the epic transformations that they lived through from their perspective, through their eyes. And I have very little information about them. All too little information about them. So I think maybe, as Adam said, I have to admit what I don't know and speculate or hypothesize. But I suppose another thing I've tried to do to better understand them is to work on their worlds, not just the context in which they live, but the people around them, the kinds of people. So Mary Hicks, I know, is here, and she's doing just the most wonderful work on Africans who worked in the slave trade between Bahia and the Costa de Africa, the littoral of the Bight of Benin. And I've learned so much from her work. One of my subjects was a slave who worked in the slave trade, and then he freed himself and he continued to travel back and forth working in the slave trade. And so that turned me into a very avid reader of Mary Hicks's research on the Africans who worked in the slave trade in that period. And the freed woman, who went to Rio. I have about a half a dozen pieces of information about her, but a fair amount is known about Nago or Mina slaves in Rio and their lives after they freed themselves. So I've kind of I've tried to reconstruct my subjects about whom there's very little information by better understanding the circles in which they moved as they moved through time. I guess I would just answer or conclude what I'm saying, Tatiana, is, for me, it's been a very humbling experience, honestly. And I really, every day, have to stretch myself and feel that I'm trying to understand places and people and answer questions about which I know all too little. So it's been for me a really humbling experience.
Thank you. I look forward to reading the book, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see that we have some other contributors, Natalie Everst, who is here. Also, I think that Laurel Samley arrived. But in any case, whoever wants to jump in and ask questions or add comments, add your perspective, especially if you are an author and you have, I see Mary Hicks here, then Mary, you can just go ahead and comment or ask a question.
Thank you. This is really fascinating, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak to all the contributors to this wonderful volume as well. And as Mariana was talking about the panel that inspired this volume, I was actually at that panel. So it's a nice nostalgic event to be at as well. So I had a question. A lot of the chapters in this volume were about labor and property. And I was wondering if any of the panelists have thoughts on how centering the lives of African women and African female historical subjects changes or alters or informs some of our larger narratives about the history of Atlantic capitalism.
Okay, who wants to, I don't know if any of the editors or if the contributors. Feel free to jump in.
I don't want to talk all the time, you know, considering that some of the contributors are here. But I would highlight, and maybe they will feel they will be able to talk more about their own chapters. But I'm thinking in the chronology of the book, you know. For example, the first chapter is by Suzanne Schwartz, who looks at land grants, for example, in Sierra Leone. And this is a clear case that of a topic that hasn't received much attention on how, and I will let Suzanne talk more, so I'm not talking over Suzanne, but her chapter shows that goes back to what Adam was saying earlier, and Christian men were talking about how we find these fragment narratives about women in the past, and they relate to bigger topics, bigger events taking place. And what we see in several of the chapters, and here again I'm thinking about Vanessa Oliveira's chapter that is stress the role of powerful and wealthy women who are basically lending money and giving an opportunity to foreign men to engage in trade in Luanda. Also shows that these big conversations about capitalism going on and around the world at this moment, that has for many ways excluded Africans in Africa, and African societies need to include also how Africans were dealing with these questions related to claiming property over land, claiming property over other human beings. And many of the chapters engage with topics, ideas that are central to African history, but also to slavery societies in general. You know, how you control dependence, what happens after emancipation, and Ademidi's chapter shows that, you know, you can have, what happens to people who have freedom without financial compensation and ability to live lives as free people. And you see this happening in many ways. And part of the conversation, I think, one thing that bothers me a little bit about the scholarship about Atlantic World is how African societies are neglected, as if Africans only exist when they arrive in the Americas, in this conversation about capitalism, or on this conversation of wealth concentration, and we don't look at African societies and what is happening there. So also, I don't want this book to be seen as it's only about women. It is about these big themes that interest historians, Africanists, and not, and that we can show, we have shown in this book that several authors have encountered enough primary sources to address these issues, looking at the individual stories of women. But I will let Vanessa or Suzanne or Ademiri talk.
Is it okay if I jump in there, Anna? Can you hear me?
Yes, of course. Go ahead, please.
Hi, yeah, so thanks, Mariana, for highlighting those points. I think, as some of you know, I started working on Sierra Leone and Freetown specifically many years ago, and it struck me just how when company directors or colonial officials on the ground talked about how they were developing an emporium of commerce, and when historians picked up on that, women really weren't part of that picture. There's Frances White's book for a later period, but for the period I work on, the late 18th, early 19th century, little attention to how women played a part in the development of that urban settlement. But to pick up specifically on the question, one of the strengths of working with this excellent team of scholars in this book was how I was struck by how women's experience was really shaped by local circumstances. So one of the themes I emphasize in the book is how, although this colonial setting presented opportunities for women to accumulate land and property, as a result of reading and hearing the work of my fellow contributors, I was struck by how the status of the Nova Scotians, the Jamaican Maroons, as strangers and outsiders in Freetown through their migration, limited their opportunities in so many ways, and particularly given the moral expectations, the legal framework of the colony, that those women weren't allowed, although some did, to hold slaves. They couldn't compete with the type of wealth that we see in other colonial settings in East and West Africa, such as the examples Mariana dealt with. So I think very much local circumstances determining the opportunities of women to accumulate property, land, accumulate property and people in different ways. So I think that's comparative approach that came out of the book I certainly found very enriching for my own work.
Thank you, Suzanne. Anybody else who would like to react?
I think I can jump in and talk a little bit about my chapter. My chapter, I'm looking at marriage petitions, and I think it dialogues very well with other chapters in the book, like the work of Hilary Jones and Mariana's Candido's work, in the sense that we are dealing with relationships between African women and foreign men. And basically what I do in my chapter is to look at these relationships, and I'm looking at a series of marriage petition 107. And what I see in these petitions is that women of high socioeconomic status, they were mainly marrying foreign men. So these foreign men who arrived in Angola, mainly from Portugal, but also from the Atlantic Islands and Brazil, they were marrying these women that were coming from families of high economic status and who are affiliated to Portuguese cultures. So they had something of a similar cultural background. But more important, and I think this differentiates my chapter from the chapter by Hilary Jones and also Asan, is that by the second half of the 19th century, some women in Luanda specifically were able to accumulate money out of the relationship with foreign men. So these were women who were able to accumulate money into inheritance from their parents, and also through their participation in the local trade networks, especially in the supply of foodstuff, but also through the transatlantic slave trade and by acquiring slaves and property. That's a big theme in this collection, the accumulation of property, including land, but also urban real estate. So many of these women, they were already wealthy before marrying these foreign men. So, and this is different from the case of women from previous generations that I look at my work as well. In my book, for example, I'm looking at the women from previous generations that became wealthy through their relationship with foreign men, But in this article, that's a little bit late. It's already like during the era of the illegal slave trade, women had been able to accumulate money on their own. And these women, they were marrying these men that were coming to Luanda, and they were actually poor. They were petty traders, shopkeepers, and these men were marrying these women, and they became able to advance their careers in Angola. So we have one case, for example, of a Portuguese man called Albino Soares, and he arrived to Angola in the 1840s. He became a shopkeeper, and eventually he married a local woman who had money. And in one decade, he was able to become a coffee baron. So this woman, she initiated a plantation, a coffee plantation that became the most productive coffee plantation in Angola. And he eventually became one of the wealthiest men in the colony. Of course, he had the support of his wife, and also he built up his careers with the connections, the commercial connections that this marriage opened up for him. So I stop here. Maybe other people like Hillary can talk about her work.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Nice to see you. And then let's see if anybody else would like to jump and react to this, to the comment, perhaps. Adam, go ahead, Adam. Okay, just have to unmute yourself, yes.
Yeah, I would just add that it's important to see the section of the book about property in connection with the following section about vulnerability. Because if we just focus upon the kind of people that Vanessa has just mentioned and the extraordinary amount of wealth that they managed to accumulate, and we have Mariana's chapter with the inventories of the jewelry and the clothing that some women left behind and so on, we need at the same time to remember the dangers in which some of these people were. If we take Colin Krieger's story of an Afro-European woman who marries an Englishman who then dies, she becomes wealthy, but no sooner has she done it than her wealth is being contested in the British courts, and she has to fight a long battle for it. Natalie Evert, who may want to talk about himself, also deals with fairly well-off women on the Gold Coast who are faced with totally exorbitant demands from rival kin groups, and who find that they, precisely because they are in close connection with Europeans, they don't have the kind of network that other women around them have in order to protect them. And so they have people telling them, your great-great-grandmother owed a debt to my great-great-grandfather, and therefore you should be my slave, and so on. And Christine Mann's chapter likewise tells us a story of a woman who is fairly successful in moving from Brazil to Lagos and establishing herself, but she ends up being murdered and robbed by somebody living in her own household, despite the fact that British colonial rule has been looking after law and order in this colony for 10 years beforehand. So property is one thing, but it is a property that is not in the sense of capital accumulation. It is not what we normally think about in that sense.
Thank you, Adam. There is a question that is coming from Adriana Chira, and Jessica is going to read it. She left the question in the chat.
Yes. Hello, everyone. We can hear me. Adriana's question is, could you tell us more about the use of property as an analytic category? It seems that the gendering of this category helps reveal the role of social relations that women are at the center of, like kinship, intimacy, or households, at the center of as they're making, in the making of property. So it's a question about property in the chat. And I guess I'm guessing that's open for anybody and everyone.
Thank you. Who wants to jump? And the question by Adriana is also, if it's also in the chat, if you can scroll the chat for those who want to react.
I can jump in if, since I'm thinking, I don't know that I'll be able to answer the analytical question analytically, but I'll give it a shot from what I'm thinking of based on what we've just been discussing and on what I wrote about in the chapter that I contributed to the volume. And so, you know, I think one of the really exciting things about being together with the scholars that Mariana and Adam put together and being able to have these conversations is that we could think about the ways in which someone mentioned capital, and that could maybe be thought about in a lot of different ways, but whether it's property or land or assets or the ability to generate what people need to survive. So I'm even thinking of this even more broadly, right? If we think about Asan Sar's chapter, for example, women in the Gambia, Mandinka women had access to land at one moment, which allowed them to do the kinds of things that were necessary for their survival and their own family's survival. And then that becomes sort of foreclosed as the colonial period and the introduction of cash crop economies and peanut culture comes to dominate the landscapes of places like Senegambia. In my particular chapter and in the work that I was sort of thinking about for this project, I'd worked in the Senegal archives and very familiar with the records of trading companies. And like many of us, you know, I face that, as Kristen was mentioning, that sort of sense that there's so much fragmentation sometimes in these sources. And by having these conversations, I think for me, and you know, I was thinking about the hemispheric question a bit, but you know, I think it was also really enlightening for me to be able to think more deeply about the ways in which we see similar practices, strategies, connections across our different work, even if they don't manifest themselves in exactly the same way. And even if the people that we are trying to bring to light in the studies didn't cross the Atlantic, right? Some did, some didn't, but in these various ways. So for me, one of the focuses about thinking through property was to look at intimacy and to look at the ways in which, on one hand, that could be achieved for some of these women by entering into marital relationships or conjugal relationships with foreign men or even men of elite status who might come from mixed racial backgrounds, for example. But it was also about their relationships with women. And I think sometimes those kinds of strategies don't show up in records like the ledgers of trade houses or of officials who are collecting data about the movement of goods and properties, and even in court records. For me, in my chapter, one of the things that I sort of honed in on, and in connection with Vanessa's work and with Mariana's work, was that of inventories and what happens after sometimes powerful men die, and their women are the ones, whether they're their mother, their wives, their daughters, usually they're widows, but also daughters are the ones who are in charge of resources in ways that give them the ability to be caretakers for other people's resources, to parlay those into other, sometimes property accumulation. In the case of one of the figures in the chapter that I write about, where she was able to, she was in charge of the goods of her husband's retail business, but then also all of the kinds of houses that he owned and properties that he owned. And one of the things that I think we can see by thinking about property in a maybe more expansive kind of way is that oftentimes these material and I'm thinking particularly about the material of property, moved around in intimate ways that were not necessarily captured in official records. So, you know, that's what I'm sort of thinking about in terms of this answer about, or this question about property and the movement of capital, and how we can also see this moving between women in their friendship circles, or and I won't just say friendship, but in their relationships of hierarchy within households, where, you know, there were women who had very close relationships with other women, but they may have been in positions of power over women in their households. And I would also maybe just sort of connect that to Adam's point about vulnerability, that one of the things I think we see in all the chapters is that there are moments when there are women who are quite adept at using the access to resources that they have, and then that can be completely taken away from them at another moment. And they have to sort of figure out how to make their households work, make businesses work, survive in some cases.
Thank you, Hilary. We have a question that Mariana Brax, she has been there with her hand raised for a while. Then I will go with Mariana first, and then we have Christine and Herman. You are going to follow the order, then just hold there and you are going to be able to ask your question. Mariana, go ahead, please.
Hello, thank you very much. Congratulations for the organization. I'm from Brazil, a junior scholarship from Sergipe. I'm so excited to be part of it, the opportunity to. Okay, my question is to Professor Suzanne Schwartz about Sierra Leone. I'm now in a research in a postdoctoral project about some women who occupy the central positions of power in African society. So I'm searching a lot of women, and I have the name of Queen Yambakuba from Shermo people. In the text, the chapter of the Professor Suzanne, she talks about very quickly about her, this woman, and about the Mami Yoko from Mende people who ruled in the late 9th century, formed a powerful confederation using the spiritual power from saint initiation. And in the end of her life, she signed treaties with the Britons. And in the end, she took the blame for the colonization. She suicided. And my question is about the relationship between those chefs. Professor Linda Rose, they cite a lot of women, more than 30 women who were female chef in Sierra Leone. There's a long tradition of power, female power there. And my question is the relationship about those women who arrived, the adaptation, those merchant women that in 9th century are in the trading that are described in the Suzanne's chapter. The relationship between those women, the merchant woman, and the traditional power, that woman power. She can talk about more from those two, Yambakuba and Mami Yoko. She can give more information about her. So
thank you for the question. It's so nice to meet someone else who is interested in Queen Yamakubra. She crops up, first of all, in 1787. She's one of the signatories to the first treaty for the so-called Province of Freedom. And she gets a bit of a bad press in the colonial records. People like Zachary Macaulay and other colonial officials from the Sierra Leone Company phase who just dismiss her. They see her as a bit of a pain in the neck because she keeps coming and asking for alcohol. And I think that says more about the views of the colonial officials than it tells us about Queen Yamakubra. What I've been able, and this is picking up on some of the comments of the other contributors about the fragmentary references. There are so many fragmentary references about Queen Yamakubra, which I'd be happy to share with you. And a very different picture starts to emerge if you turn the table, start reading between the lines and seeing her role. I think she was one of the advisors to the most important male leader, so she needs to be contextualized in that way. So yes, so there is fragmentary information which could be put together for her. One of the things that I touch upon in the chapter is the second point you make about the relationship between the immigrant women, the strangers, and Timony women, and that's something I want to explore through trade, particularly. Many references in the records of the company, the different officials, describing the number of Timony women, also Muslim women coming into the colony and interacting. And I think going back to a previous comment as well, the household becomes particularly important for that interaction. The first liberated Africans released at Sierra Leone included a large number of Timony and Mende. And so that's another context in which you have the interaction between Timony females and the settler women. So it's something I think we could pick up in later correspondence, but yes, it's that trying to take those fragments and tell a very different story to the one that the colonial officials wanted to tell about women who had no influence, who had no power, who were just irritating, made no contribution to their societies, but reading it in a different way gives a very different story of their lives, seeing it from their perspectives. So we should correspond. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Suzanne. Then I think that you have Christian, Herman, and Adam also wants to respond. Then I don't know if Christian is the next. Do you want to allow Adam to go?
Well, Adam, what I was going to say follows directly from Adriana's question. Does your question follow directly from what we've just been talking about? Or would there be more continuity for me to go ahead and say what I wanted to say about Adriana's question? I'm just thinking about continuity of conversation.
Okay, yeah. Could be either. Mine also addresses that question, yeah.
All right, well, I'll say what I was going to say and I'll be brief. Adriana's question about property as an analytical question and what can be learned from gendering property as an analytical question, and what might that tell us about the role of social relations, where women are at this, where women are at the center in the making of property. Yes, I think that social relations, where women are at the center or close to the center, are central to understanding processes of accumulation and how both men and women build up property, but often not in ways that show up directly as property accumulation or in property accumulation, because in many parts of West Africa, husbands and wives, for example, had very limited rights in each other's property. So, what a woman accumulated, her husband had limited rights to. And that property would not pass to her husband. It might pass to her direct children, but not to her husband, and vice versa. But there are ways in which marriage, what happens in marriage, centrally the alliance created when families were united in marriage can open opportunities that significantly affect the accumulation of property and other resources. So, I think when I think about your question, I think yes, but we have to look at it not so much in relation to property per se, but the social processes that allow men on the one hand and women on the other to accumulate property. Thank you for your patience, Adam.
Thank you. Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, no, that's good that you expect that. I was just going to this last question about female power in Sierra Leone. Suzanne has talked about the one case, late 18th century. The other person who was mentioned, Mami Yoko. If the Sierra Leonean historian Arthur Abraham, who died last year, had heard this question, he would have been very indignant, because he wrote an article in the I think, the late 1970s, using Mamiyoko as a case for the argument that there's no such thing as traditional female power in Sierra Leone. Mamiyoko gained power as a stooge of the British in the late 1890s. And it's a long time since I read that article, but I found it fairly convincing in the case of Mamiyoko. So I don't think you should put these two women into the same case or the same bucket.
Thank you. And then now I move with Herman, and you have a question from the chat as well, another one from YouTube. Go ahead, Herman. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you very much, and I feel privileged to be here. And what really piqued my interest was that I just finished my dissertation on property and real estate on the Gold Coast in the 18th and 19th centuries. So I thought this was really exciting, and I'm particularly interested in vulnerability because in my own work, I examined vulnerability in relation to the loss of family houses due to the practice of real estate. So I was really interested in the ongoing conversations on vulnerability in the sense that the Atlantic world offered opportunities for trade and accumulation, but then it also had its own pitfalls where merchant families could lose their family houses, which were supposed to be sacred and spaces of burial. They could lose that. They could lose it to European firms just because they had used that as they had used their houses as collaterals or as mortgages. So I was wondering. I've always suspected that this was not necessarily unique to the Gold Coast, and it probably happened in other parts of the Atlantic world. So I was just wondering if there's any such thing in other parts of the African Atlantic world.
Thank you, Herman.
Yeah,
who wants to jump to answer that or to comment, to react? Go ahead, Adam.
Well, Natalie has written on the chat that she hasn't got her microphone, so she would be much more competent to answer it. But I think what you say rings very true. It's credit and inconsequent debt is a key topic in the economic history of not only the Gold Coast, but the Gold Coast is a good example that you clearly know. And yes, many of these, shall we say, tragic cases involve people who maybe not themselves, but somebody else in their kin group incurs debt by taking a loan, and then is faced with demands that nobody can meet without pawning somebody from the household or something. So it is, I think, yeah, it is still an under-examined topic. And I would imagine that we would find cases all along the Atlantic coast of West and West Central Africa.
Yeah, if I can jump in, this is some of the chapters address this. Some of the authors who contributed to the volume address this in their work, perhaps certainly not in this volume, but on other spaces. Stephen Salas is writing a dissertation where he's looking at cases of people who are seized because of debts in the interior of Benguela. Vanessa, Oliveira, and I just finished a chapter where we talk about township in West Central Africa. So we see these different moments where people are mortgaged, but also land is also being used to mortgage, and perhaps a Sansar chapter will interest you. I think you enjoy reading a Sansar chapters, what he has to say about land use. I just, going back to, I don't know if I can, sorry, I am talking, I shouldn't be talking, but I just wanted to mention something about property, going back to Adriana's comment, and perhaps bringing Esteban and Laurel to the conversation, although Laurel chapter not necessarily talk about property, but Esteban is someone who is looking at land use and vulnerability in Catumbela, a place that is not studied at all before the 20th century. And it relates to questions that we are discussing earlier about fragmentary evidence and that Hillary mentioned, what happens with documents that are not there to record the presence of women. And Steven has shown that you can find lots of women in this type of nominal list where you have indication of production. The colonial officers are interested in recording production of beans and corn. But surprisingly, Steven found lots of information about women, about land access, and topics that have not been really studied for West Central Africa. So I think it relates not directly to your question, but in some ways there is the question of access to land and how it provides rights and protection to people, and how people become vulnerable when their lands are seized and occupied by others. But I just want to emphasize that Laurel, Simley, and Steven Salas are connected here, but they haven't had a chance to talk about their chapters yet.
Thank you. And I think that we have, I don't know if Vanessa wants to pass our questions that we have either we have one in the chat, and you also have from YouTube, I think at least two of them.
Yeah, I'm happy to bring our YouTube questions to the session. So there are actually two, and I think both of them could be answered by any combination of editors and contributors. So Jessica Reuter asks, or says, the editors raised a really interesting point in the outset of the introduction about how Atlantic African towns had female majority populations. Could either the editors or contributors discuss further how this demographic reality shaped women's and girls' lives in specific geographic contexts? So certainly plenty to say there. And DG Toye says, how resilient are the economic or even spiritual institutions from the old country, by which I think they mean the continent, which centralize women in the Americas? So really a question about what transfers across the Atlantic, what survives of some of the institutions you're pointing out over the course of the collection.
I could talk a little bit about the idea of the sort of majority community. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. So my screen is a little bit glitchy. Can you hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I could talk a little bit about the idea of sort of women, these sort of towns and cities where you have majority populations of women, right? Gorée is a wonderful example of that, I called it a city of women, right? Because you have a majority of women and women in a prominent position, particularly in the 18th century. And what I think is an interesting way to think about it is I think that when people think about Gorée, I think the focus has been on portraying that image of this community of women as one of a community of mixed race women, right? Of women who are elite women, all along the coast, right? Of women who have access to power, property, and also have the power to enslave others. One of the things that I was interested in looking at that comes out a little bit in the chapter, not so much, but I explore a little bit elsewhere, is that thinking about these women as part of a larger community, right? That they're connected to a larger community that includes African women, right? That they're while they might be enslaving women, that they're part of a larger community of Africans, and that some women who were included in this category of Seigneur were also sometimes African women, right? That they weren't always mixed race women. And you could see that category shift over time. But in the case, and so that when you have a community that is so much controlled or sort of dominated, I wouldn't say controlled, but dominated by a presence of women in so many different categories who have these different positions at the in terms of having power and also being disempowered. You can see women sort of crossing and transgressing these different boundaries. And so I think that when you have port cities that have these large numbers that are predominated by women, you see that complexity and you have that ability to see that complexity. And I think that when we look at these cities and we don't just see the women as all fitting in one category as all the women are powerful, and we start to see that nuance and we start to see that that texture that makes for a more interesting storyline. And then we can also see the connections between those port cities as those women are mobile as well as vulnerable, right? Because again, as people have been saying, that mobility often comes hand in hand with vulnerability. And you see that, I see that a little bit with the storyline of Anne Rossignol, to the extent that she is able to be mobile and she escapes that, but you see the sort of a little bit of the ways in which she is vulnerable at the same time. In the end, I realized that I'm still not sure why she ever, the exact reason why she leaves Gorée in the 1770s, in the moment that she does. And it doesn't mean that she's leaving in a moment of power. It could be that she's leaving precisely because she is facing some kind of challenge. I hope that answers the questions.
Thank you, Laurel. Then we have more questions coming from other places.
Lucia, can I just jump in there as a follow-up to Laurel's answer?
Yes.
Well, instead of focusing on a port or a big city, I focus on places in the interior of Benguela. And that represents a methodological challenge in terms of the access to sources, because most of the sources for West Central Africa focus on the two major ports, which are Luanda and Benguela. So as opposed to more in-depth analysis of specific cases, I came across this fabulous source, which is a nominal list about one of the places in, well, it's a coastal area, but in the interior of Benguela, that is called Katumbela. And the particular aspect that the source allowed me to analyze was distinctions of power. So it's pretty much common sense, the idea that agricultural production was in the hands of women all across sub-Saharan Africa, right? And we have important studies that have shown nuances to that statement. But in this specific case, the nominal list allowed me to see that although most of the population in this town were women, and most of the people working in agricultural production were also women, women were not the majority of people having control of the production, control of the land, and control of the dependents that were producing this or that were in charge of agricultural production. So it also, like the specific case is for a time period of 15 years, I don't recall exactly. And it's also a small place that has not attracted like a large attention so far. But at the same time, the possibility that this source allowed to see the larger like demographic composition of the town, and at the same time power distinctions also speaks to the possibility, like the ability of women to have access to land on one hand, but on the other hand also how constrained it was by the presence of a majority of men who had most of the access to land and dependence also. Yeah.
Thank you, Esteban. Who wants to join the discussion? Then we have other questions that are coming from different places. Then we just need to coordinate. We have Natalie that she is commenting on in the chat, and we have questions coming from YouTube that perhaps Jessica wants to cover them. Those from YouTube. Or from the chat, I don't know which ones you want to cover. Go ahead, please.
Let me do the ones from the chat.
Okay.
If there's not someone else while the YouTube re-ups. So we have Jacques in the chat, who is thanking everyone, all the wonderful contributors. Has a question for, it says for the editors, but I imagine anybody can speak to it, as you guys seem to do a lot of gathering together and thinking through the structure of the book. I was just wondering why there is no chapter dedicated to the famous Dahomey Amazons. Also, so that's one question, and another question about the ways that having a woman on a ship was quote unquote jinx. But do the authors have examples of women slave traders who regularly made the crossings back and forth? So those are two different questions, and I take it to you. I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Jessica. I can answer that. But the reason why we don't have a chapter about women working on the Dahomey Amazons is because we didn't have a contributor who joined the ASA panels. So there was, this was not an open call for paper for a volume. This was a volume that resulted in different conference panels, conversations, and there is some similarity in the topics that we work on. So we don't have anyone who works on the Dahomeys, but there is scholarship on the subject. And what we are interested here in many ways is shedding light in new topics in areas that haven't been really studied, and on themes and women who in many ways are not visible to scholars who are not working in the regions that we have focused our research. On women as slave traders, we have plenty of examples of women as slave traders. Some of them are covered in the volume. Vanessa Oliveira has a book that focus coming out very soon in a few months, where she focused on women who were merchants in Rwanda, many of them slave traders. I have written about it. I mean, there are women slave traders everywhere. In fact, I think that what all the research and all the contributors shows is that there is lots of information about African women in the primary sources. And the question is, why aren't more people working on these women? Some of the contributors have been doing this work for several decades. But the fact is that most Africanists don't pay attention to women, and the excuse is always that women are not in the primary sources. But as we show, all of us who contributed to the book show, is that there is an abundance of sources and there is a lack of interest of writing about women in many ways. And I think this is what we are trying to push here, that more people will not only do more research about women in Africa, but engage with the work of Africanists who work on women. And in many ways, they're neglected by people who work on slavery in the Americas, who not necessarily work, read, and cite the work of people who work on women in Africa.
I would like to jump on this comment, Mariana, because I think that you brought an interesting point. For those of us who are doing especially then more Atlantic history and trying then, of course, to engage with the both sides of the Atlantic, I think that you raised important points, and especially because sometimes we have people attending these sessions who are graduate students who are planning perhaps to work with these topics, and perhaps who would like to engage with the history of African women. And my question would be the following. Then on the one hand, we have much more studies over the last 20 years on enslaved women in the United States. Then we have a huge number now, a good number of books that are being published focusing on the experience of enslaved women. And for a very long time, we know that we had the same excuse about enslaved women, even in a place like the United States, that the sources didn't speak about them. Then we know that it was not the case. You have more and more books discussing then these cases all over the United States. We have, of course, in other parts of the Americas as well, the Caribbean. We have this book that we're going to discuss in March by Tatiana Seijas, that is this added book, which is also an original book because of that, because it's one of the first books bringing these experiences from an hemispheric dimension. But I ask myself why. What we see in terms of in terms of Africanist research regarding women, of course, you have much more works than about the 20th century. And even if you go back I was looking at a book, edited book, I think that was Joseph Inikori who co-edited that book. Now I don't remember who is the co-editor, about 20 years ago. And those were books that 20 years ago didn't have one single woman historian who was a contributor. Then scholars like Christine Mann here perhaps were among the few women Africanist historians of her generation that is a generation that is overwhelmingly then represented by men. And I ask myself why we have this gap. On the one hand, because this field has been dominated by men. On the other hand, we know that many women, including women of African descent, who are not necessarily engaging with the history of these African women in the continent, or the scholarship produced by women and women of African descent, then I ask myself why we have that problem. One of the issues that because of the work that I am doing now, that I have been asking if one of perhaps the problems is that this Africanist scholarship very often is very dry and directed to an audience that is poorly academic. Then we have, of course, many academic articles, you have these monographs, but very often then they are not, I would say, spread among larger audiences, even among undergraduate students. And this is why I think that the book that you did here is important, because this book can reach these broader audiences, even if it's not a book that you are going to find at the airport or in a bookshop. It is still a book that is accessible. And I put this in a way that I think that is important, that those of you who are writing about women and African women, that you take these works that are works intended for a scholarly audience and try to make this more accessible to more people, not in terms of, for example, of making the sources accessible, but in terms of making the scholarship accessible, written in a way that perhaps more people will be interested in having access. And the other problem, of course, this would be the last point, it's in terms of the access to the archives. If you can talk a little bit about the archives that you explored in this book. Then I did a review of this book for the African Studies Review, and I know the chapters and what you were doing, but perhaps for the others who are not necessarily familiar with the work that you were doing, in terms of the archives, if someone who wants to include this dimension in his or her work, what will be the problems in terms of having access to the archives? I'm not talking here about the gaps, the silence of the archive. It's not about that. Having true access. For example, Angola, we know that perhaps 30 years ago, access to the archives was problematic. It's no longer the case, but it still is easier to go to Philadelphia or to New York than to go to Luanda. Then if you can just explore a little bit this dimension.
Anna, can I just jump in that context? Particularly your comment on the archives. Many people might know about this already, but through the British Library Endangered Archives project, I've been working with Paul Lovejoy on organising the digitisation of materials. So if people want to go to the British Library Endangered Archives website, EAP 443, there is masses of material containing so much unexploited material on women. McGann Coulon is with us today, I think. She's working on some of that material. So we're trying to make that archival material available, and I think there are probably 50 PhD studentships to be pursued in that material. So it's very exciting. We've got more coming available through EAP 782. Gosh, isn't it sad? I know all the numbers. So if people could watch out for that, it should be later this year. So a bit of an advertisement if people don't mind me doing that.
Thank you, Suzanne.
I hope Adam will help me on this question of archive and access. And why I think the earlier scholarship on African history was very much focused on political history. There was a need to write this political history, otherwise we couldn't do any other history of the continent. So I think what you are mentioning as the dry history perhaps is this wave of political history that dominated the scholarship in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But this has changed. And I think they are very, there is interesting scholarship. They are very easily readable books written by Africanists. Many of them who are here in this meeting today. But the question is the very few publishers that publish the scholarship on African history. It's very different from people working on slavery in the Americas. We have very few publishers, and there is a very clear book in mind. If you want to publish with Cambridge, if you want to publish with Ohio, if you want to publish with Indiana. So we have very few options available. And I think this is a big issue for Africanist historians. But I think the other issue is that we are a small group of people. And to be very honest, people working on slavery in the Americas until very recently didn't care about African history. So I think it also works in both ways, that Africanists not necessarily engaged with the scholarship being produced in the Americas, and vice versa, except for people working on the transatlantic slave trade. But otherwise, it will be very difficult 20 years ago to see someone working on slavery, I don't know, in Cuba, interested in reading more about Angolan history. This is how the field was organized, and this is a serious problem in the scholarship. We produce, we publish, and people not necessarily read our work. I think this is very evident, and everyone who is here and who has published anything must feel very frustrated that your work is not cited in spaces that you think it should be cited, but somehow people are not paying attention to your work. So I think this happens, and there's extensive scholarship discussing that show that women tend not to be cited. Minorities tend to not be cited in the scholarship. So I don't think there is anything new and unique to us as a group. I think it's the way the academic world operates in the United States, particularly. On the question of access to archives, this is a serious issue because it's about inequality, it's about people who have access to travel to the archives. It's much cheaper to travel to Lisbon, for example, than it is to go to Angola. It's very difficult to convince universities, and believe me, I have changed jobs quite a few times, and now I learn how different universities operate. It's very difficult to convince people that going to Angola and staying in a very simple hotel is expensive. People think that it's, I don't know, they have an image that it's a vacation, that you're going to stay in a 5-star hotels when sometimes you don't have access to electricity and running water. And you're living a luxurious life compared to the people who live in the archive, even if you don't have electricity or running water. So there is all this issue about access, inequality, who has funding to go to these archives, which is a serious problem. It's a serious problem that affects junior faculty, senior faculty, graduate students, and in many ways makes it more difficult to have scholars working on African archives. It's also very difficult to convince departments that you can have more than one Africanist accepted into a PhD program. Usually departments think that one is enough. We don't need 2 people working on Africa. There is nothing to be said about Africa. Anyway, this became a rant about long conversations that has happened in my life. But I think this creates the inequalities that exist in the field, that it's much easier to have access to an affordable book about slavery in Brazil, in the United States, in Cuba, than it is to have access to an affordable book about anything on Africa. But books are expensive. But Adam has, for example, transcribed and make available lots of archival documents available to people who cannot afford going to the field. And I think this is also something very important that Africanists have been committed since the beginning of the field, to make primary sources available for people who cannot afford or who cannot go to different countries in Africa related to different situations. And Adam Jones is someone who has always been committed to that. So I think this is also important to recognize that this important scholarship not necessarily results in a wider recognition in the field. And it's so vital for graduate students and people who cannot travel to have access to these collections of primary sources transcribed and translated into English.
Thank you. It's true, and especially now in COVID times, I think that these volumes, I am always saying, the one on that we have the big one about the Lawson family by Adam, and also all the volumes by Robin Law, who is not necessarily very visible in the, especially here in US, that historians and scholars, they needed to be visible on television or social media and so on. But he has this important work that make our lives easier right now. But I don't know, folks, there are more people who have questions or others want to jump with comments. You have about 15 minutes and we feel that we still have a lot to ask, but go ahead, please.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, I did actually put a question. It was about the populations on the coast that were female majority. Was that because a result of the areas being depleted of men as a result of the slave trade?
Okay, then Adam, perhaps you can go ahead.
Yes, I would say, well, certainly that is a primary factor. It is certainly not the only factor, but clearly more men were being exported than women. And the question then is it a push factor or a pull factor? Is it the slave traders paying a higher price for men than for women, which is true to some extent? Or is it African societies, that's to say the people who have a say within African societies, deciding that it is of more importance to keep women in their society than to keep troublesome men? And I think it is a bit of each. I think it needs more investigation, but the signs are that it is not just a matter of the higher price for male people being exported. It is also to do with big men wanting to have a majority of women around them for economic and many other reasons.
Thank you, Adam. I don't know if you have any other questions coming from elsewhere. I'm not seeing anything coming from YouTube. Then if you want to jump.
Can I just follow up on that? I also, several chapters in this volume also show that cities provide opportunities that women might not have in other spaces, including, for example, access to colonial courts where they can fight for some rights that they wouldn't have otherwise, but they can also accumulate wealth because they can provide different types of services in urban centers. So there is also there is a demographic factor which is very important related to the transatlantic slave trade, and this is very true, for example, for Rwanda, from Benguela, for places that have that lost large numbers of people. But cities also become spaces where people can reinvent themselves. And I think Colleen Krieger discussed this in her chapter, which creates lots of vulnerability for women who also don't have the protection of relatives, kin members, and powerful people.
And also, if I could add that in some people I've seen this phenomenon of women being predominant in other Atlantic cities on the other side of the Atlantic, right? Precisely for that reason, that cities offer opportunities for certain women, for single women, for widowed women to be able to acquire goods, acquire property in ways that they otherwise wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, in my dissertation, I expand a little bit more on this issue, but not only on cities, also in places in the interior, there is a tendency for the female population to grow. And this is from the mid 18th century through the mid 19th century. And I suggest there that it grows to a rate in which it suggests that these women are not being born in place where they are counted, but they are also internal migration. So it's not only that women are the majority of the population because men left or were deported forcibly, but also because in places of agricultural production, people gather and work and move there to live, whether freely or forcibly.
Thank you, Esteban. Any more people who would like to intervene here? We have, let's see if you have more questions from the chat. Okay, who is, okay, go ahead.
It's Alessandra.
Okay, go ahead, please, Alessandra.
Yes, so apologies for arriving a bit late, and I am looking forward to seeing the video again when this is over, because I'm so sorry that I missed so much. But I did feel that one area that I would like to suggest, and I think has been touched around the edges but hasn't really been convened here, is that to what extent does this predominance of women populating certain spaces, and for me, what would be interesting is looking at the island populations along the coast to see how that may have transformed the culture of the society within those spaces, whether it's because they're small spaces or whether there's a concentration of certain activities or resources in those spaces. To me, there's something that needs to be explored further in terms of these island spaces beyond the fact of there being a jump-off point for transporting of human beings. So we haven't really looked at what happens within those cultural zones, and there are intriguing aspects of it in certain island communities along that coast. I wonder if anybody has had a chance or has seen any material that might be of interest.
Thank you, Alessandra. We have about 8 minutes. Then anybody who wants to either react to the comment or who want to add elements perhaps that we didn't, that we're not able to cover, just go ahead, please.
Just want to mention, following up Alessandra's question, that yeah, the whole idea was not to be exhaustive, but no, so hopefully more people will be inspired and do more research. But we do have chapters that focus on Gore, so we do have information about some islands, and we don't have anything on other ones, but it's because of the nature of the entire project. But once again, hopefully more people will do this job and do the research and publish.
Thank you, Mariana.
Yes. I should also mention, sorry, that there is extensive scholarship in Portuguese about Cape Verde, about São Tomé, that is not necessarily accessible in English, but there is important scholarship, particularly on women, that is available for these regions.
Right. Well, I knew about the material around Gore, but it seemed to me that James Island and some of the other spaces that are associated with the mainland still require some exploration. And I'm glad that you said, I hope it does inspire others to look at the material, particularly accessible information that may be in Portuguese that's not accessible to the rest of us, because we may be missing a little bit of the picture there. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a question. I think that is Chin Soriano who wants to ask a question. Go ahead or make a comment.
Oh, hi. Thank you, Anna. And thanks to everybody for this very rich and engaging book. Really looking forward to reading more of it. But I did have a question that Suzanne and I brought up quite a while ago, I think it was in ASA in San Diego, is that I would think that the main reason to accumulate property, especially if you're the state, is to get taxes. In a broad sense, in some of the other areas, and not so much Sierra Leone, but looking at further down the coast, was the state looking at women as just another revenue stream at this sense to develop the colony, as opposed to relying on the metropole or whatever? Or was it just, should that be looped into the conversations that we've been having today about women gaining agency through property, for example? And that's open to anybody. Suzanne's heard this before, so.
Thank you. Who would like to respond, to react? This is going to be our last question. Then go ahead.
Is it me?
Okay, you can go ahead, Mariana, if you want to react.
I can react. Well, many of the records are about, especially the European records, are about control of the population, taxation, and Esteban's chapter focus on the type of documents that it is about taxation and control of the population. The same is true for Suzanne's chapter that look at land grants, but even in records that are not necessarily about taxation and like court records that Chrissy men use. I think one conversation that we had 4 years ago when we were in Dublin is also the question of the primary sources and how it shapes the kind of stories that you can reconstruct about these women, and how it stresses some aspects of their lives that are so much more visible to historians nowadays than other aspects of their lives. So we know much more about economic activities than, in most cases, about religious lives of these women, with very few exceptions. So I think this is one of the issues that we have with the documents that we have available in many ways. It shapes the kind of narratives that we can create about the past and our work.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you so much. We are going to stop here. Then you have perhaps the contacts, and I would like just to emphasize that the book that you are reading today is African Women in the Atlantic World, Property, Vulnerability, and Mobility, edited by Mariana Candido and Adam Jones. This is a book published in 2019, then by an imprint of James Currey. And the book, of course, is available on hardcover if you want to ask your library to purchase, and also, of course, on paperback. And you can have then on Amazon or directly with the publisher. And I call your attention that we have a full program for the next, for this month, January, February, March, April, May, and the last session of the Slavery Archive Book Club is in June. And the next one is going to be January 16. And this is a Saturday, and you are going to read The British Museums by Dan Hicks. And this is a book that was just published in November about the Benin bronzes and all the debates on restitutions. And this will occur then on Saturday at 1 p.m., January 16. If you go to the website that is slaveryarchive.wordpress.com, you have all the sessions and you can register on Zoom there. But otherwise, I would like to thank our guests, then Mariana Candido, Adam Jones, all the authors who have been with us today, Laurel, Esteban, then Suzanne, Christine Mann, and all of you. Thank you for this great work. and you can give the links if people want to watch this discussion on YouTube. And I particularly want to thank Alex and Jessica and Vanessa. Vanessa already left, but thank you so much for being here. This is a difficult day, but I am glad that you were able to make it. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you all
Thank
for
you,
joining us.
everybody. Good night.
Bye-bye. Zoom, bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Bye. Thank you.